In this video lecture, we're going to look at the physical setting of Texas government. We'll look at the regions, the features, the rivers, and the cities. Now, there are many different graphic ways to express that information. The simplest is an overview, which has the coastal plains located to the east, the mountain basins located to the west, the high plains, the northern prairies, the Edwards Plateau, and the South Texas Plains. This is not inaccurate. However, it is unfortunately a little bit too much of a simplification. The Texas Parks and Wildlife has its own version of it. As we will see, there are some problems with this particular illustration. The Panhandle Plains, the low plains and the high plains are linked together. The prairies and lakes area are combined. And of course, the area to the south is greatly different than the area toward the north. The Piney Woods is pretty consistent, but the Gulf Coast, the area south of Corpus Christi, is significantly different than the area north and to the east of it. Hill country, I think there's pretty much agreement to that, and overall the South Texas Plains. Now you can go overboard as well. This is the Bureau of Economic Geology's map of the state of Texas, and this is TMI, a little bit too much information. What I like to use is the one that was put together by Dr. Loren Kinnemer of the University of Texas. I was a student of his back in the 1960s, early 1960s. And this is the one that we will have on the test. Piney Woods, Coastal Prairie, Post Oak Belt, Blackland Prairie, the East and West Cross Timbers, and in between the East and West Cross Timbers, the Grand Prairie, the Low Plains, the High Plains, the Mountain and Basin region, and the Edwards Plateau. In the middle of the Edwards Plateau, there is the Llano Basin, sometimes known as the Llano Uplift. The thing that's very different about the Llano Basin, or Llano Uplift, is it is a granitic batholith, exposed Precambrian roots of the state, and then the South Texas Plain. There are some pretty important features, too. The caprock separates the low and the high plains. The Balcones Escarpment runs all the way, and it's easier to see from Del Rio up to just about Waco, almost Waco. From that point on, it's not quite as easy to distinguish. Now, those of you who had geology know about plate tectonics. Actually, Texas has a couple of plates that are sort of welded together and haven't moved significantly in many millions of years. To the east is one plate, and to the west is another. Now, if you'll think of a hinge, basically there's a hinge up far to the north of Texas in Arkansas, and the land has slipped down on the right-hand side and up on the left-hand side. There's also the Guadalupe Mountains, the Davis Mountains, and the Chisos Mountains. Along the coast, we find Galveston Island, the Matagorda Peninsula, the Matagorda Island, the Mustang St. Joseph's Islands, and Padre Island. Get that mouse over. Rainfall patterns in Texas range from very, very wet in East Texas with almost 56 inches of rain per year on the average to less than 8 inches of rain out near El Paso in the Franklin Mountains. So if you want to think of it, it's kind of like a zebra pattern for rainfall. In some years, the wet band shifts to the west. In other years, the wet band shifts to the east. Now, Texas doesn't have any really major rivers. It has some very large river basins, but it doesn't have any really large rivers. To the west, there is, of course, the Rio Grande River Basin, and then you have a number of smaller little areas. This is the Neches River. Then you have the Guadalupe, the San Antonio River. You have, and there's smaller ones down along the coast that I'm not going to bother you with. The Brazos River, the Colorado River, the Trinity River. We'll take a look at those river basins. In fact, if we start on the far western side of the state, we have the Rio Grande, which is fed by the Pecos, Nueces, N-U-E-C-E-S, which comes from the southern edge of the Edwards Limestone, joined by and the three rivers run together just about where this little escarpment runs to the northwest, from the northeast down to the southwest. Then we have the Guadalupe and San Antonio rivers. The San Antonio River is a small spring-fed river that begins in the heart of the city of San Antonio, called San Pedro Springs. Guadalupe River. The Colorado, which is fed by a major tributary called the Pedernales. The Brazos River. The San Jacinto, or San Jacinto River. The Trinity River, which runs from the Dallas-Fort Worth area down to east into Trinity Bay, which is a part of the Galveston Bay complex. The Neches, N-E-C-H-E-S River. The Sabine, the Sulphur, and the Red River, and the Canadian. The Canadian is kind of just a passing stranger moving through. It is not a high-flow river because it doesn't drain a particularly wet area of the state. There are a number of lakes in Texas, but none of them are in excess of 10 acres that are natural. Caddo Lake is the only naturally occurring lake in Texas of greater than 10 acres. Now later we'll talk a little bit about aquifers. They're the underground water-bearing structures. There are quite a few aquifers in Texas, major and minor aquifers, but the only ones that we really want to have to worry about in terms of this course are the Gulf Coast Aquifer, which sits all along the coastal prairie, and at one time Houston drew virtually all of its water from the coastal aquifer. The Edwards Limestone, which is a relatively smallish aquifer that of crushed limestone that collects water falling on the hill country, and at one time discharged it largely through springs. Now it's used very heavily for municipal water supply, particularly by the city of San Antonio. And then the Ogallala Formation, which extends from Texas all the way up to Nebraska. It has been extensively utilized for agriculture, and as it has become depleted, it's had major economic impact on the high plains. Last but not least, we'll look at the cities of Texas. Now, we could spend a great deal of time, energy, and effort trying to go through all of these cities. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you that virtually every city in Texas is located, with a few exceptions, on a river and in a region. So if you know the river and the regions, then you can plug the cities in. For example, the easternmost major city on the Trinity River on the Blackland Prairie is Dallas. A little further down to the south, you have Waco, which is at the juncture of the Blackland Prairie and the Brazos River. At the Blackland Prairie and Colorado River, you have Austin. Blackland, basically at the very tip of the Blackland Prairie, there is, of course, San Antonio. El Paso sits in the western part of the state of Texas on the Rio Grande. Now, two of the only really significant cities in Texas that are not anywhere close to a river are Midland and Odessa, and they were built as railroad towns, and they drew water from the Permian Basin to be used for the railroads. So this concludes our very brief study of Texas physics.